Ground covers today. My name is Kelly Allsup. If you have heard me speak before, you've probably heard me talk about insects or pollinators or something related to that. I'm a huge advocate of creating wildlife habitat with our gardens and sharing our our passion with the butterflies and the bees and all the different things that live in the backyard. But I'm also a huge advocate of not planting boring plants. So, one of the things that I really, really cannot stand at all is when I see a ground cover of daylilies. Um, I think daylilies have their place. I know why people grow them because they're super easy to grow, but after a while they look awful, and that would not be what I would choose as a ground cover. Another thing is a lot of people use junipers as ground covers. I think it's a really boring option. I think there's other things that you can use. So I came up with a list of some ground covers that I prefer and I like. So this is just a list of what I think is cool. But I also started talking about this topic because I did an experiment last summer on lawn alternatives. Now, there's not a lot of research in this area, but I used a community garden within a community garden near Bloomington, Illinois, and I decided that I would plant these lawn alternatives in between the rows of tomatoes and garlic and peppers. So I used some micro clover, and then I did some Dutch white clover, and I did thyme. And I wanted to see how well they would do in this setting. So really, um, micro clover, clovers really are native to Europe. We know that clovers fix nitrogen, they enrich the soil, and they used to clover used to be prized in the lawn back in the 50s. We just got to where we, wanted to spray all the broadleaves out. So, but growing clover with your lawn actually improves its health. So, the micro clover, it's called white clover. It has smaller leaves, fewer flowers. It actually has a lower growth habit than Dutch white and is a little bit less aggressive. Now, the Dutch white forms these clumps rather than kind of like a mat that the micro clover forms. And adding in micro clover to your lawn mixes actually makes the grass appear a little bit darker. But there are some drawbacks to this micro clover. It doesn't fare very well in drought and heat, but it can be some more tolerant than some grasses. So, it has its pluses and minuses. Now, if you look, you see the little small seed in the soil, and it's encapsulated in something. And what it's encapsulated in is the bacteria that attaches to the roots of the plant that helps fix the nitrogen. Well, I didn't necessarily need it in this area because I'm sure there has been some kind of clover growing in those beds before. But if you've never had clover, then you really want it to be coated with that bacteria to introduce that bacteria to the site. So what we did in the spring is we spread our seed. I know it says it's more expensive than, say, turf seed, but it wasn't horribly expensive. We also did Dutch white clover, and actually, these three pictures is where I got my inspiration. The first picture was at a community garden in Chicago, where a bunch of us horticulture educators went on this kind of community garden tour. And I thought it was just brilliant that they were using clover instead of grass. That way they didn't have to mow quite as often. They were, it was attracting pollinators into their garden systems. Just thought it was a really cool idea. The first picture is more the Dutch white because it blooms more. The micro clover doesn't bloom quite as much as the Dutch white. But this last picture, I call this living mulch. So what happens is in the early spring, you plant your ground cover, and then if you look in that little circle, there's a tomato plant. And we know that tomato plant will be just fine finding its own place and growing, and it'll actually benefit from the clover. So it was just a really interesting way of using clover, whether it be as a lawn alternative, whether it be as a living mulch, whether it be something you want to plant to attract to your garden. Again, like I said, not a ton of research out there on this, so that's why I wanted to do it. I also did this thyme. I think thyme is a wonderful ground cover. It spreads so great. And really, I think, that would be, my four things to what makes a good ground cover a good ground cover is, does it spread quickly? Will it combat weeds? Will it stabilize the soil? And then we go to this other question that all horticulturists and master gardeners and master naturalists get asked. Why can't I grow grass under trees? Quite simply, grass wants sun, and it's almost impossible to grow grass under trees. It's better to do a mulch ring or do some type of ground cover. So even though this one, it blooms profusely in June and July, I love planting herbs for pollinators. I think they are one of the most, underutilized plants when it comes to that particular purpose. It spreads really, really fast. It only grows a fourth of an inch high, and it has full sun. And then it actually is somewhat evergreen in mild winters. I know last year my thyme stayed a little bit green throughout the whole winter. It tolerates some foot traffic and rocky soils. I mean, it's a tough, tough herb. So, I mean, you look at how I planted these plants. I just bought plants and I planted them maybe 2 feet apart, which, if I were a professional and had more money, I would have planted them a little bit closer. But you look in this picture on the right, this is what it looked like 1 year later. And then this is what the Dutch white clover looked like the left year. Now the white clover didn't do as well, and I think it just didn't fare the winter quite as much. So even though, and I did go and weed these plantings twice throughout the first summer. And so and I haven't weeded yet this year because I haven't been able to get into the garden. But was able to take this picture. And if you really look at the one on the right, it really is choking out some of the weeds. I mean, definitely the thyme is the primary plant in this setting. And so it's creating a nice cover on the ground. Something that I experimented with. I'd love to experiment more with these kind of lawn alternatives because we know that, if you watched May Berenbaum with her insect apocalypse, we know that we need more flowering plants. We need alternatives to lawns. An interesting idea. So there's this other program from University of Minnesota called the Bee Lawn. Really, really quite interesting program. Well, they're talking about how we mow our lawn, what we could do to, improve our lawn for bees. Well, what we do is we typically mow about 2.5 inches. So being horticulturists slash gardeners, you guys know that usually plants, equal out their roots with the top of the plant. So we know how important root growth is. Well, if you mow to 2.5 inches, is what we typically do, you're only going to get 2.5 inches of roots. But you could mow to higher and get more roots, and therefore the turf that you do have is much healthier, has more drought resistance, more disease resistance, and more resistance to weeds. One of the questions that I'm not the biggest fan of is when people ask me about plants like Waltzinia, which is the barren strawberry, or plants like violets. They don't want them in their lawns. And I don't completely understand that. And the reason is because the Waltzinia and the violets actually do much more for the environment than just lawn. I understand people want to see a lawn, but I feel like we're a little bit past this whole manicured lawn. We actually want to see, a little diversity. So adjusting the mow height, I've actually tried to do this, but I have a cheap lawnmower and there was no way for me to adjust. But I've looked at other people's lawnmowers and there is a way for you to adjust. You can adjust it by moving the levers on the back of the wheels. So you're going to let your lawn reach 6 inches and then you're going to mow back to every 4 inches. And this is after you've established some of these crops. So how do you do that? You have a lawn in your backyard, so you do it in the fall. You kind of scalp the lawn, meaning you let it be as low, you mow as low as you possibly can. And then you kind of aerate the soil a little bit with maybe a pitchfork or, a hoe, because you got to get that seed to soil contact, or it won't germinate. And then they actually promote these, some of these plants, lance leaf self-heal, creeping thyme, Dutch white clover, lance leaf coreopsis, and calico aster, and then sowing those in the fall. Sowing in the fall is an amazing idea because what you're missing out on is some of those plants, those weed seeds that need cold treatments in order to germinate. So they're not going to germinate when you're watering and trying to get this this bee lawn started. If you want to see some pictures of some of those plants that were talked about on the left, this is the lance leaf self-heal, beautiful. And on the right is the calico aster, and on the bottom right is the lance leaf coreopsis. So it's not going to be this perfectly neat lawn, but you are going to have little clumps of plants. And then that's when you mow them to 4 inches. When it gets 6 inches, you may, take off some of the flowers, but you're not going to take them all. So I just wanted to introduce that idea. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it before, and a lot of you have thought about it, especially people who are thinking more and more about how the wildlife uses their backyards. So I'm gonna go into, this is just the fun part where I'm gonna talk about some pretty ground covers, and really I don't want this talk to last an hour, so we will go through some of these, and maybe you'll have questions on specific site requirements and I can answer those later. Chives. Now, admit it, you never thought about using chives as a ground cover, but they're aggressive. Oh, that makes them a wonderful ground cover. They'll spread quickly. They'll combat weeds because they spread quickly, and they'll help stabilize the soil. I mean, who would not want this beautiful cover of purple blooms in April and May? So you can do these in full sun to part shade. They look like these, it looks like grass. And then just like, I just cut back my chives maybe, um, you know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and now, so I cut them back. It looks like, a cut turf. And then now all these new shoots are popping back up. And so it just really looks kind of cool, and you can let them be a little bit wild and let them go to seed like the picture on the left, or you can cut them back and have these nice little neat tufts of growth. They're super accessible, easy, they're resistant to deer. And yeah, I think, I've actually, at our local hospital, have seen them grow chives as a ground cover underneath a tree. And I thought, wow, that is a really cool use of ground cover. Parsley. I went to, oh man, I am forgetting the name of that garden. It's in northern Illinois. Mark, I am so sorry. But they used parsley as a border. And I'm telling you, that was the thing that stood out. It wasn't these large columns of colorful plants. It was the parsley borders that was just so cool looking. And so I did plant a bunch of parsley in my garden this year. And I usually do plant parsley because, like I said, I'm a wildlife gardener. Um, because the black swallowtail caterpillars will eat it. And the black swallowtail is on the left. So when people complain to me about about the swallowtails eating their parsley, I'm like, let them eat it. Um, and parsley's really not that good of an herb anyway, right? I'm just kidding. So here's a picture on the right of that caterpillar, and if you poke it, it will send out this yellow forked gland called an osterium, and it smells bad. A wonderful activity to do with the kids. But imagine having, a border of these parsley plants or a ground cover of parsley. Look how dark green it is. I mean, it's bright, colorful, and it's great for caterpillar feed. You'd have so many caterpillars. The only thing that is required for parsley is this is not going to be your drought tolerant one. This is going to be one that you're going to want to water a little bit, and you're going to want to make sure it doesn't have the tough soils, but it does have a little amendment of organic matter before you plant. Epimedium. Another one which was inspired by a botanical garden, Missouri Botanical Garden. We went to, they had a display, and they were called stump gardens. And so they had these beautiful stumps all throughout this little tiny garden. And then they had hostas and this epimedium all throughout it. And it was just really, really cool how clump forming those hostas and that epimedium was. And the epimedium, I mean, it chokes out the weeds. You grow this and you're not going to have to worry about weeding it too much. So the new growth is actually kind of chartreusey, so you get that extra added benefit in the early spring. And then it really creates this woodland setting. It actually blooms in April. It has these really pretty, maroon colored flowers. They're delicate. They're not really, the most showy things, but it's a great addition to a really cool looking ground cover. It tolerates drought, but that's once it's established. And I would have to say that that's for a lot of plants. You can plant a ground cover and the first season, you're probably definitely going to have to take care of it. You're going to have to do additional watering. You can't just plant it and walk away. But, after that, there are a lot of these will tolerate some drought. Um, and then this one, you cut back the foliage in the spring to get that new growth. Um, Sorry, I have a child. Longwort, pulmonaria. The reason why I love this flower is because I love the kind of multicolored blooms that it produces in the spring. It's one of the first ones to bloom too. It really makes me think spring. But what I think would make it a good ground cover is that it has this really strikingly beautiful foliage. Now, this might be a more expensive ground cover, but if you had a smaller space and you had a shady location, this might be perfect for you. It fills in the space. It spreads 2 feet, so you could spread. It'd probably take a couple of years for that spread to actually happen. So if you wanted instant, I might plant them a foot apart. If you're okay to wait for a year or two, I'd plant them 2 feet apart. Um, um, they require some water, and then this right one is Majesty, and it has a silver gray leaves and is only 10 inches tall compared to the one on the left. Now, the one on the left was a plant at Illinois Central College. That in a master gardener project, and it really is quite a stunning plant, and even when it's not in bloom, it's very, very attractive. It makes people stop and look. Wild ginger. I know this is probably one you guys definitely have seen many times before and thought about, but the one thing that I don't like is I don't like the use of some of these aggressive invasive species. For instance, I don't like vinca. I think it is not a good choice for gardeners or naturalists to use. It can become very aggressive, and it is on the invasive species list. Uh, Ivy, not a great ground cover to use. Um, so, what makes those ground covers so great is that they're willing to establish in pretty tough soils in the shade. Well, a great alternative would be this wild ginger, and they have those beautiful kidney shaped leaves, and they spread by rhizomes, and they spread pretty quick, and they can be quite attractive. And even though the bloom is not the most showy bloom, it is something that can be quite interesting when you lean down and look and you see it blooming in April and May. And then you see this beautiful mat of wild ginger. It does tolerate some wet soils, but because you have the wet soils, then you might have some issues with slugs. And since I am, that integrated pest management person, that might be, a time for you to, divide out a little bit and spread these out a little bit more and redo the ground cover. Because eventually you're going to have to, it's going to fill in quite quickly and be beautiful for a couple of years, but then you might have to go through and redo that ground cover so you don't have that problem with the slugs. But if you have wet soils and shade, and you don't ever have problems with slugs, this is perfect for you. I don't think slugs are like one of those pests. They're not the pests that I worry about because they don't take huge chunks out. I guess I'm sure people with slug problems are probably rolling their eyes at me. But they're not really gonna really harm the plant unless you get a huge population. I love yellow archangel. And the reason why I love it is because it has a late bloom. Another reason why I love it is because it fills in fast. So you would never, like all those plants that gardeners, don't want to plant in their garden, these are the plants you want to plant as ground covers. Um, it has this beautiful bloom in June. It grows about 1 to 2 feet tall. It looks great with other plants. Um, it can tolerate drought once established, and you can shear the plants, and then it can also climb. So don't feel bad. Don't feel like you can't cut back some of these ground covers to get some new growth and make it look refreshed and not quite as tired. Little Bluestem. Now, I know you guys, have you ever thought about using Little Bluestem as a ground cover? I mean, it is amazing. It's so beautiful. I mean, look at it in this left picture. I would probably get out of my car and go, what is that plant? Because it just has this gorgeous bronze orange fall color, and it's a native, and so it's another one for the wildlife. Songbirds eat the seed heads. Skipper caterpillars eat the leaves for food. Just really great visual interest. Um, and then it spreads about 1 to 2 feet and 2 to 4 feet. So if you had a really large area and you want to just, that's another thing I really like about ground covers is they're visually stunning because, you look at a garden and there's yellow here and purple here and this isn't blooming and this isn't blooming. But then when you look at this ground cover, it's just like this visual overload of this, um, this bronzy orangish color, just really gorgeous. And I really think that little bluestem is one of those tough, tough plants that can really take some pretty tough environments. So you have a space, you want to fill it with plants. Little bluestem might be one of your uh, ground cover options. I've been obsessed with sedges lately. I just feel like I read this book, and if you heard me in the spring 4 seasons, I did the known perennial garden with Roy Diblick, and he really loves these sedges. And the reason why I kind of agree with them is they're kind of these underutilized, cool looking plants. They're accents. I mean, not every flower in the garden is supposed to be, a hibiscus or a rose. You're supposed to have those, those accents also, and they really are quite adaptable to, uh, tough conditions. And they look really cool planted in mass. So I'm just really into the sedges. This is a blue sedge. Another thing about that Roy Diblick book that I really like is that he talks about the spread in the matter of years. So, you're one of those people that's willing to wait, that doesn't have a lot of money to buy lots of plants, then you can, plant them 26 inches apart and know that they will mat together in 5 years. If you don't want to wait 5 years and you only want to wait 2 years, you plant them 16 inches apart. I mean, yes, you're going to have some maintenance issues where you might have to do some divisions or cut some out, but I like the idea of what I love about Roy Diblick is I like the idea of knitting plants together rather than have plant, mulch, plant, mulch, plant, mulch. I don't care about the mulch, to be perfectly honest. Mulch is not that pretty. The plants are what's pretty. And then this one, well in dry conditions, will go to full sun, to part shade. They have these little brown spikes, which aren't really, as beautiful as, the allium next to it. So Roy Diblick likes to mix this blue flaca with the allium, summer beauty, and create a gown cover out of the two species. Blue Plumbago, when I was in college, this was my favorite ground cover. I used it in every single design. And the reason is because I love that you see the fall color with the blue blooms. I mean, talk about full season interest. You can't go wrong with this plant. It blooms July through September. That's a long bloom time. That's a really great plant. That's one of the, that's, like your catmint. That's one of your, you have to grow this plant. Um, it's about a foot tall, spreads about a foot. What makes it a great full sun to part shade, spreads by rhizomes. So it really forms this thick mat that won't let any weeds grow. Again, the multiple seasons of interest, and then this bronzy red fall color that comes after the blooms, and the really long bloom time. And then it has a really cool name. Now say this with me. Ceratostigma plumbaginoides. Now say it 5 times. I mean, that name just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Blue Plumbago. It looks gorgeous at this botanical garden next to this rock and this boring yew, but man, it just makes the whole thing look good. Sedum, if you are not growing some kind of sedum, you are missing out in gardening life, especially this Angelina. Oh my gosh. I don't know what it is. I think it's when something has a fall color, I go crazy. I feel like, yes, this one has this beautiful yellowy color. Then in the fall, it gets these kind of red oranges, ginger brown tips that just makes it look so cool. And it looks really cool before, but then you get this little added extra season of interest. It's really mat forming. People plant these in rock gardens. I have this planted. It's seeds, so not seeds. You can divide this and pull up plants and put it in and basically throw it in the ground and water it a little bit and it'll root in and it'll be fine. So yes, it's an aggressive plant. You might find this, growing along your walkway or growing in a mulch bed or in some rock. But it just proves how great of a plant it is. It's pretty tough. It blooms June through August. It's not that, it's not that beautiful of a bloom, but mine is a different kind of sedum and that bloomed underneath my tree. And it was just yellow. But what I noticed is that with the sedums is after they bloom and they're really mat forming, a little bit of trimming back might help produce some new growth and make them look neater. And then here's your rabbit one. If you have rabbits or deer or drought or heat, I actually think my next talk is going to have to be on heat and drought because these Illinois summers are getting crazy. Spiderwort, the most common question I get on spiderwort is how do I get rid of it? Which makes me think, hey, spiderwort's a pretty good ground cover because it's pretty aggressive. It's a clump former. It'll grow in part shade. It has these really cool looking strappy weeds. Now this is not the neatest ground cover. It's not like parsley or chives. But then it has these beautiful blue flowers. And they're continuous. That's another thing I really love about spiderwort is I love continuous blooms throughout May and July. You always have something blooming. Now it's not covered in blue the whole time, but you always have some little flowers coming on. This Lucky Charm actually has a more compact habit. Now I know that, traditional spiderwort that I've seen in a garden, sometimes it can be quite leggy. I personally like the more compact one. I don't love the leggy one. I really feel like it would not make a wonderful ground cover. But the compact one I think would do just fine. Sprawling habit. This is for you master naturalists out there. I planted mountain mint for the first time. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was doing a pollinator pocket and I wanted some natives in there. And so I decided, hey, why don't I do this mountain mint? We have this area of the garden that's full of rock, that's right next to the sidewalk, that never gets watered properly. It's mint. Wouldn't it do well? Yes, it did very well. It is aggressive. We have to get it out of some of the other plants. But if you know, a lot of native plants are really quite aggressive. So some of those plants keep it in check. It has these pink clusters on top of the silvery bract, July through September, which I think is a really interesting time to bloom. I know from July through September we need more blooming stuff in our landscape. What makes it a good ground cover? It is a vigorous grower. It spreads by rhizomes. It has aromatic foliage, of course. I meant it is a mint. It's covered in butterflies and bees. I meant covered. And it's drought tolerant. So again, this one, like the Tradescantia, not as neat looking of a ground cover, but that depends what kind of, person, what kind of gardener you are. Personally, I would probably use something that I knew was going to be more attractive to butterflies and bees versus the more neat looking. Which is why, but then again, you have parsley. It looks beautiful, beautiful green, very neat looking, and it's great for your black swallowtails. Geranium, everyone should grow perennial geranium in their garden. And they should go get one of the newer cultivars because the newer cultivars are really quite compact. And they bloom for a long time. This is just one of the plants that, again, I love things that bloom for a long time. I love the, early June through August. You can't beat that. Again, you're going to plant 10 inches apart for them to fill in 2 years, and 16 inches apart 5 years. That's not a lot. What makes it a good ground cover? Just multiple seasons of interest. Very adaptable. It has these really cool leaves. These leaves actually turn red in the fall. Now, how could any gardener not put this plant? Okay? Not put this plant in their ground. It does well in clay soil. It'll do full sun to part shade. It looks good from early June. It still looks good in May. You have these kind of newish tufts of growth that look really cute all the way into the fall. And it's easy to take care of, and you don't have to worry about it too much. I should plant this all over my yard. And plus, we know that this perennial geranium attracts a lot of butterflies and bees and flies and wasps, and it's really great for the pollinators. Gallium odoratum. I loved this one in college too. It was always my go-to when it came to moist conditions. If I had moist shade versus dry shade, I would always go for the Gallium. They have creeping roots. It has fragrant foliage. This one actually tolerates black walnut. So if you are one of those that are lucky enough to have a gorgeous black walnut tree and you do want to grow something around it, Gallium odoratum would be your go-to. They have these white blooms in April and fall. Not the most showiest of all plants, but just a really cute kind of fine textured ground cover. Brome grass. This is another one that I stole from Roy Diblick because I loved this bottom picture in the right where he's got the brome grass mixed with the hosta. That is beautiful. That's just two plants and it just looks so cool together. This soft texture. It doesn't spread too fast, but it'll take light shade to full shade. Um, and then it's one of those, another one for the moist conditions. So I might put, I might actually let brome grass grow with gallium, because they do both conditions. And you don't have to do all one color when you think about all one color, one type of plant when you think about a ground cover. You could do a matrix of plants, a mix of plants, and still call it a ground cover slash garden. These are all the resources that I used in putting together the presentation. We have the ground covers, University of Illinois, that flowering bee lawns, that was University of Minnesota. I got a lot of my images from Missouri Botanical Garden. I love Missouri Botanical Garden. They give me really great information on how to grow plants. And Illinois Wildflowers, it's one of my favorite websites, because they connect the plants to the insects that are visiting them. So I might go to Illinois Wildflowers, and I may type in perennial geranium, and it'll say these kinds of bees are attracted to it. You'll see this bird, and it's just a really cool website. If you've never gone there, I encourage you to do it and check out some of your own plants and see what kind of faunal associations that you'll have. This is my contact information. You can just Google Kelly Allsup. I fortunately have one of those unique names. Probably I'll come up first. So that's it. And then if you want to register for upcoming webinars, this is where you go. And you can scan this code to take a survey. Otherwise, the survey will be sent out through email. And I know that all of you got my my notes, my handouts ahead of time.